The morning Raymond Donovan rode into Cimarron Valley, New Mexico territory, the year being 1882. The sun had barely cracked the eastern ridge, and the first thing he saw was a woman standing in a corral, completely alone, gentling a wild-eyed stallion with nothing but her voice and the flat of her palm. He pulled his sorrel gelding to a stop at the fence line and watched, because a man would have had to be dead in his boots not to watch. The stallion was a blue roan, maybe 16 hands, with the kind of muscle that spoke of good breeding and bad temper in equal measure. The woman was slight against that animal, but she didn't carry herself slight. She stood with her shoulders square and her chin level, and she spoke to the horse in a low, steady stream that Raymond couldn't quite make out from the road, but whatever she was saying, the stallion was listening. His ears swiveled forward. His nostrils flared, and then slowly, like a tide going out, the tension left the great animal's hindquarters, and he dropped his head toward her outstretched hand. Raymond Donovan had been buying and selling horses across 3 territories for the better part of 7 years, and he had never seen anything like it. He dismounted, looped his reins over the top rail of the fence, and waited. He was a patient man when patience was required, and he had learned early that interrupting a horseman in the middle of a working moment was the fastest way to make an enemy before you'd even shaken hands. The woman spent another 10 minutes with the roan before she turned and noticed him. She didn't startle. She simply looked at him the way a person looks at something they've already factored into their plans without knowing it yet. "You're standing on Baker land," she said. Her voice up close was clear and direct, not unkind but not soft either. "Theodora Baker," he said. "That's right. Raymond Donovan, I sent a letter 3 weeks ago about your horses." She walked toward the fence, pulled her leather gloves off one finger at a time, and tucked them into her belt. She was somewhere around 27 or 28, he guessed, with dark hair pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat, and eyes the particular shade of brown that looked almost amber when the light hit them just right. There was a smear of stable dust on her left cheek that she appeared entirely unconcerned about. "I received your letter," she said. "I didn't write back because I hadn't decided yet whether I wanted to sell." "And have you decided?" She studied him for a moment. "Come up to the house. We'll have coffee and talk about it." The Baker Ranch was not the largest spread in Cimarron Valley, but it was one of the most efficiently run operations Raymond had ever set foot on. He noticed things the way a man in his business noticed things: the state of the fences, the condition of the water troughs, the way the outbuildings were positioned relative to the main house. Everything here was thought out. Nothing was sloppy. The barn was sound, the paddocks were well maintained, and the horses he could see grazing in the far pasture moved with that particular fluid grace that told a horseman these animals had been raised right from birth. The house itself was modest, a 2-story adobe with a wide front porch and window boxes that held something green and stubborn against the dry climate. Inside, it smelled of coffee and wood smoke, and something herbal he couldn't identify. Theodora Baker poured 2 cups without asking how he took his, and set them on the kitchen table along with a plate of cornbread that was still warm from the skillet. Then she sat down across from him and folded her hands on the table and waited for him to start. "I'm putting together a remuda for Colonel Whitfield's cavalry post over at Fort Union," Raymond said. "He needs 20 horses broken to saddle, sound on all 4, and able to handle mountain terrain. Your operation came highly recommended." "By whom?" "Elias Croft over in Mora County. He said your bloodlines were the best in the territory." Something flickered in her expression at the mention of Croft's name. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of acknowledgement. "Elias is generous with his opinions," she said. "He's also specific. He named 3 of your animals by name. The roan I saw you working this morning, a gray mare called Duchess, and a buckskin gelding he said was the finest trail horse he'd ever sat." "That buckskin is copper," Theodora said, "and he is not for sale." "I'm not here for 1 horse, Miss Baker. I'm here for 20. I heard you." She picked up her coffee cup. "How much is the colonel offering per head?" Raymond named a figure that was fair by any standard measure. It was the number he had negotiated with Colonel Whitfield before he left Fort Union, the number that gave him a reasonable margin to work with, the number he had paid at 3 other ranches without any significant argument. Theodora Baker looked at him without blinking, and she named a figure back that was almost 40% higher. Raymond set his coffee cup down carefully. "Miss Baker," he said. "Mr. Donovan," she replied pleasantly. "That price is, with respect, considerably above market." "These horses are considerably above average," she said. "What Elias Croft described to you, the bloodlines, the training, the temperament on mountain terrain, that doesn't happen by accident. I've spent 4 years developing this herd. The roan you watched me work this morning has quarter horse and Andalusian blood going back 3 generations. He will not spook on a cliff face. He will not quit on a hard trail. He will not founder on poor forage because he's been conditioned on this land, which is not gentle land, Mr. Donovan. You know what a horse like that is worth to the United States Cavalry." He did know. That was the problem. He tried 3 more times over the course of that morning to bring the price down to something that made logistical sense for his commission, and 3 times she held the line without so much as shifting in her chair. She was not rude about it. She was not stubborn for the sake of stubbornness. She simply knew what she had, and she priced it accordingly, and she was entirely comfortable letting him walk away if the numbers didn't suit him. By noon, Raymond Donovan had agreed to pay her price for 18 of the 20 horses, with the understanding that she would have them trail-ready within 6 weeks. He rode away from the Baker Ranch that afternoon with the curious sensation of having been thoroughly bested by someone who hadn't raised her voice once to do it. It was not an unpleasant feeling. It was the feeling he got when he encountered something genuinely excellent, a feeling that was equal parts respect, and something that nagged at him considerably more than respect. He made it as far as the town of Cimarron itself, 4 miles east, where he took a room at the only decent boarding house the town offered, a place run by a widow named Mrs. Alvarez who fed her boarders well and asked few questions. He told himself he was staying in town because overseeing the readying of 18 horses was part of his professional obligation to Colonel Whitfield. He told himself this several times that evening while eating Mrs. Alvarez's excellent green chili stew, and he believed it completely, right up until the moment he found himself thinking about amber-brown eyes and a woman who could gentle a roan stallion with nothing but her voice. He was back at the Baker Ranch the following morning before 7 o'clock. Theodora was already in the barn. The Baker Ranch employed 3 hands year-round. There was Hector Reyes, who was 43 and had worked the ranch since Theodora's father ran it, a compact, bow-legged man who said very little but missed nothing. There was a young man called Weston Clark, 20 years old, who had a good instinct with young horses and an unfortunate tendency to sing off-key while mucking stalls. And there was a woman named Guadalupe Mendoza, who handled the breeding records and the veterinary work, and who regarded Raymond's arrival with considerably more open suspicion than either of the men. "You're back," Theodora said when she saw him. She was checking a bay mare's legs, running her hands down the cannon bone with practiced efficiency. "I thought I'd observe the stock over the next few days," Raymond said. "Standard practice before a delivery of this size." "Standard practice," she repeated in a tone that suggested she found this interesting. "It is," he said. "Hector," she called toward the back of the barn. "Mr. Donovan will be around for a while. Please don't let him get kicked." Hector appeared from behind a partition, looked at Raymond with an expression of profound neutrality, and went back to whatever he was doing. Raymond spent the morning watching the horses work. Theodora put 3 of the animals through their paces in the large paddock, while Weston ran another 2 on a long line, and Raymond stood at the fence and watched with the practiced eye of a man who had looked at thousands of horses over 7 years of trading. Everything Elias Croft had told him was accurate. These animals were exceptional. Their gaits were clean, their response times were good, and not one of them spooked when Raymond walked the fence line or when Weston dropped a coil of rope in the dust with a loud snap. But what Raymond found himself watching, more than the horses, was Theodora Baker. She moved through her work with a quiet authority that was entirely unconscious. She didn't perform her competence for him, didn't explain it or draw attention to it. She simply did the work, made the decisions, corrected small things before they became large things, and treated her animals and her people with a matter-of-fact respect that said this was simply how she operated, all the time, not just when someone was watching. Around mid-morning she came to stand beside him at the fence, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of horse and something warm underneath it, and they watched the bay mare move through her gates together without speaking for a long moment. "Her left hock is slightly stiff," Raymond said. Theodora nodded. "She strained it 2 weeks ago. Guadalupe says it's clearing well. She'll be sound by the time your 6 weeks are up." "I wasn't raising a concern," he said. "I was noting that you'd already noticed." She glanced at him sideways. "Of course I'd already noticed. She's my horse." "I know," he said. "That's what I was noting." She was quiet for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, the corner of her mouth moved in what was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood of one. "You're a peculiar sort of buyer, Mr. Donovan." "I've been called worse," he said. That evening, Theodora did not invite him to supper, but she also did not turn him away when Guadalupe silently set a 6th plate on the table where the Baker ranch took its evening meals together in the large kitchen. Raymond ate and listened more than he spoke, which was his practice in new places. He learned that Theodora had run the ranch herself for 5 years, since her father Martin Baker died of a stroke at 61. He learned that Hector had been with Martin Baker for 20 years and regarded the ranch with something approaching religious devotion. He learned that Weston Clark was saving money to bring his mother down from Colorado, and that Guadalupe was sending a portion of her wages each month to her younger sisters in Albuquerque. He learned that this was not simply a working operation, but a community of people who had built something together against the particular indifference of the New Mexico landscape. What he noticed, most of all, was that Theodora Baker knew every one of these things about the people who worked her land without any self-consciousness about knowing them. She knew about Weston's mother and Guadalupe's sisters, and she asked about them by name, and she listened to the answers like they mattered, because to her they clearly did. He rode back to Mrs. Alvarez's boarding house in the dark, under a sky so thick with stars it seemed improbable, and he thought about this woman who had outpriced him and fed him supper and had not once, given him any indication of what she thought of him as a person rather than a transaction. He wanted to know. He found that wanting to know with considerable urgency. The days that followed established a rhythm that Raymond told himself was professional, and began very quickly to suspect was something else. He arrived at the Baker Ranch each morning around 7, and spent the day in some combination of observing the stockwork, lending a hand when it was needed and he was permitted, and being in the vicinity of Theodora Baker. She was not an easy woman to know. She was not cold, precisely, but she had a self-sufficiency that was like a wall built from practical experience rather than from any desire to keep people out. She had been running this ranch alone for 5 years in a territory where most people expected a woman either to sell out or to remarry as quickly as possible, and she had done neither, and the doing of neither had built something in her that was very solid and very real. But she was not indifferent to him. He began to notice the small indicators of this around the 4th day. She saved the best position at the paddock fence for him without commenting on it. She began anticipating the questions he was going to ask about the horses and answering them before he could ask, and there was a particular quality to the way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't paying attention, a measuring, almost wondering quality that told him she was trying to figure out what to make of him just as he was trying to figure out what to make of her. On the 5th day, in the late afternoon, a problem came that was not a horse problem at all. Raymond was in the north paddock, helping Weston repair a section of fence that had given way in the previous night's wind when he heard raised voices from the direction of the main road. He and Weston exchanged a look, and both moved toward the sound. A man on a thick-necked sorrel was sitting his horse just inside the gate, and Theodora was standing in the dust of the yard facing him. The man was heavy-set, around 50, with a florid face and the kind of quality clothes that suggested money and the kind of posture that suggested a long habit of not being told no. Raymond had seen the type before. "The offer stands at $4,000, Miss Baker," the man was saying as Raymond and Weston came around the corner of the barn. "Cash money, cleared title, and I'm being generous given the water situation." "There is no water situation, Mr. Garrett," Theodora said. Her voice was level. Her arms were at her sides. "The Cimarron River access has been established on this property since my father's deed was filed in 1863. The survey you're referring to is inaccurate, and my attorney in Santa Fe has already put that in writing." "Attorneys say what they're paid to say," Garrett said, and he smiled in a way that did not reach anywhere near his eyes. "So do property surveyors," Theodora said. Raymond came to stand a few feet behind Theodora and slightly to her left. He didn't say anything. He didn't touch his holster. He simply stood there in the way that a man with some size and some stillness to him can stand somewhere and change the dimensions of a situation. Garrett's eyes moved to him and held there for a moment. "My associate," Theodora said, without turning around. Raymond wasn't sure if she was improvising or if the word pleased her, but she said it with an ease that made it sound simply true. Garrett looked at Raymond a moment longer. Then he made a small adjustment in his bearing, very small, but Raymond caught it. "Think about my offer," Garrett said to Theodora. He turned his horse and rode out. When the sound of hoofbeats faded, Theodora turned around. She looked at Raymond steadily for a moment. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "But thank you," she said. It was the first time she had said thank you to him directly for something personal rather than transactional, and the straightforwardness of it, the simple, unfussy acknowledgement, hit him somewhere in the chest with more force than he'd been expecting. That evening, after supper, Theodora asked him to walk with her to the far pasture to check the horses before dark. It was a thing she did every evening. Hector had mentioned it once in passing, a final round of the property before she closed the day. She had never asked Raymond along before. The sun was going down over the western ridge in spectacular fashion, the kind of sunset that the New Mexico territory produced with a regularity that still managed to be astonishing, all deep orange and red-purple, and a thin line of gold along the horizon. The horses were grazing peacefully, including the blue roan who had progressed considerably in his training over the past week. "How long has Garrett been pressing you?" Raymond asked. 18 months, Theodora said. "He owns the 3 sections to the east. He wants the river access and he wants the pasture land. He's been picking at the edges, hiring a surveyor to dispute the water rights, trying to get the deed questioned. So far nothing has come of it. But it's wearing on you." She was quiet for a moment. "It's expensive," she said. "The attorney fees, the time spent dealing with it instead of working. Is there anyone in the county who can put real weight behind pushing back?" "Judge Caldwell is a fair man," she said. "He's heard 2 of Garrett's motions and denied both of them. The problem is that Garrett has money and patience, and he seems to believe that if he waits long enough, I'll simply get tired. Will you?" She turned to look at him. The last of the sunset light was on her face, and she looked at him with those amber-brown eyes, and something in them was very clear and very steady. "No," she said. "I will not." He believed her completely. They stood there in the cooling evening air for a moment, not quite facing each other and not quite facing away, while the horses moved softly in the grass and the first stars came up in the eastern sky. Raymond was aware of the distance between them as a physical thing, aware of it in the way you're aware of the space before a fire, not quite close enough to be warm but close enough to feel the intention of the heat. "Tell me something," Theodora said, not looking at him now but looking at the horses. "You've been here almost a week. You could observe 18 horses thoroughly in 2 days. Why are you still here?" The honest answer was already taking shape before she'd finished the question. "Because I haven't found a reason to leave," he said. She didn't respond immediately. But when she turned to walk back toward the house, the expression on her face was softer than any he'd seen from her yet. And it was possible, if a man was paying close attention, which Raymond Donovan absolutely was, to see the beginning of something in it. The following day brought a development that changed the arithmetic of Raymond's situation considerably. He had ridden into Cimarron that morning to send a wire to Colonel Whitfield with a progress update, and while he was in the telegraph office, he ran into a man named Foster, who was a land agent working out of Santa Fe. They were not friends exactly, but they were acquainted through the same network of transactions that connected most people who moved around the territory regularly. They had coffee at the counter of the general store, and Foster, in the way of men who know things and find it nearly impossible not to say them, mentioned that he'd heard the Baker ranch might be coming to market. "Where'd you hear that?" Raymond asked. "Garrett's been talking to a few people," Foster said. "Quietly, but talking. He seems to think it's only a matter of time. Says she can't hold the water rights, and without those, the grazing land is worth about a quarter of what she's been valuing it at." "The courts have denied his claims twice," Raymond said. Foster shrugged. "He's got a new argument apparently, some question about whether her father's original deed was properly filed. I don't know the details, but he's serious, Donovan. He's got lawyers in Santa Fe and money behind them." Raymond rode back to the Baker ranch with this sitting heavily in his mind. He found Theodora in the barn, examining the gray mare Hector had mentioned having a shoe that needed resetting. He told her what Foster had said. He told her plainly, without softening it. She listened without interrupting, which was her way, and when he finished she stood very still for a moment, one hand on the gray mare's neck. "The deed," she said. "He's going after the original filing. That's what Foster said. My father filed that deed in person in Santa Fe in 1863, she said. I have copies. I have the original receipt from the land office. I have letters my father wrote that reference the filing." She paused. "But paperwork can be questioned, filed incorrectly, lost." "Or made to look lost," Raymond said. She looked at him. "I know." He said the next thing carefully because he understood it mattered how he said it. "I'd like to help if you'll let me. I've dealt with land agents and deed offices across 3 territories for 7 years. I know people in Santa Fe. Not lawyers, but people who know how these things work, and more importantly, people who know which rooms Garrett's lawyers are walking into." She studied him. "Why?" "Because what he's doing isn't right," Raymond said simply, "and because I'd like to." The silence between them stretched for a moment. Outside the barn, Weston was somewhere singing to himself slightly off-key, and the gray mare shifted her weight and blew softly through her nose. "All right," Theodora said. "Thank you." Over the next 2 weeks, the ranch settled into a new rhythm that included Raymond in it more completely than anyone seemed to remark upon, as though his presence had simply become a natural part of the daily operation. He sent wires to contacts in Santa Fe and received information back about the precise nature of Garrett's legal maneuvering. He helped Hector repair the water channel on the eastern edge of the property. He rode the fence line with Theodora on 3 successive mornings, learning the boundaries of the Baker land with the attentiveness of a man who is learning something because he wants to know it for himself, not because his job requires it. The horses were coming along beautifully. The blue roan, whom Theodora had named Storm because of the way his coloring shifted in different light, was now reliably handling all 4 of his riders without protest. The bay mare's hock had cleared. The Gray Duchess was, as Elias Croft had suggested, one of the finest horses Raymond had ever seen, with a movement so smooth she seemed to float over the ground. One evening after supper, Raymond sat with Hector on the front porch while Theodora and Guadalupe worked on the breeding records inside. Hector smoked his pipe and looked at the dark pasture and said, without preamble, "Miss Theodora's father was a good man." "I've gathered that," Raymond said. "He worked himself to nothing building this place. After her mother passed, it was just the two of them. She was 15 when her mother died. She started learning the horses properly then." Hector drew on his pipe. "Martin Baker used to say Theodora could read a horse's mind if she stood still long enough. He wasn't wrong." "No," Raymond agreed. "He also used to say," Hector continued in a tone that was elaborately casual, "that the ranch needed someone in it who was here to stay, not passing through." Raymond looked at the old cowhand. Hector looked at the dark pasture. "That's a particular kind of observation," Raymond said. "I'm a particular kind of man," Hector said and smoked his pipe. The information from Santa Fe came back in pieces over those 2 weeks, and when Raymond had assembled enough of it, he sat down with Theodora at the kitchen table one evening after the rest of the household had gone to bed and laid it out. Garrett's lawyers had indeed found a potential issue with the original deed filing, not with the filing itself, but with a clerical notation in the land office records from 1863 that referenced a boundary survey that had subsequently been misplaced. This was not enough to invalidate the deed, but it was enough to create the kind of procedural doubt that could drag through the Santa Fe courts for years, during which time Garrett could continue his campaign of attrition on the water rights. "What's the path through this?" Theodora asked. "The original survey," Raymond said. "If the original boundary survey can be located, the notation is explained and the question goes away. My contact in Santa Fe says there's a possibility those old survey documents were archived in the Territorial Records Office when the Land Office reorganized in 1871. They weren't destroyed, they were misplaced. Can you find them?" "I can go to Santa Fe and look," he said. "I know the deputy registrar there. If the documents exist, he'll know where they are." She looked at him across the table. The lamp between them made everything warm and small and close, and there was something in the quality of the moment that was different from the professional discussions they'd had before. This was something more personal, because he was offering something more personal. He was offering his time and his connections and his considerable energy in the service of her security, and they both knew it, and neither of them was pretending otherwise. "Raymond," she said. It was the first time she had used his first name. He noticed it with the full force of his attention. "Yes," he said. "Why are you still here?" she asked. It was the same question she'd asked him in the pasture, but asked differently now, asked with a directness that was asking the real thing. He didn't look away from her. "Because I think about leaving and I find I don't want to," he said. "Because this place and the people in it have become important to me. Because you've become important to me, Theodora." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of something being acknowledged, coming out of the place where it had been sitting and standing in the light between them. "I haven't let anyone be important to me in a long time," she said. Her voice was very quiet, without self-pity, simply factual. "Running this place alone it's been a particular kind of work, not just the physical work. The weight of being the one who decides everything, who is responsible for everything." "I know something about that," he said. "I've been working alone for 7 years. Making my own decisions and answering to no one and coming home to empty rooms wherever I happen to be." "Is that lonely?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "I didn't let myself think about it clearly until very recently." Another silence, but the warm kind. The kind that is building toward something rather than away from it. Theodora looked at him with those amber eyes, and Raymond felt the whole particular weight of the last 2.5 weeks, the fence riding and the supper table and the evenings in the pasture and the business of Garrett and the documents and all the small ordinary things that had accumulated into something that was not ordinary at all. "Go to Santa Fe," she said. "Find the survey documents. And then, if you're willing, come back." "I will come back," he said. "That's a certainty, Theodora." She nodded once slowly, and the corner of her mouth moved in the way it moved sometimes, which was not quite a smile but held all the warmth of one. He left for Santa Fe the next morning. The ride to Santa Fe from Cimarron was a 2-day journey in fair weather, through high country that was beautiful in a spare, serious way, all juniper and pinon and red rock rising against the blue sky. Raymond rode with his mind, moving between the practical problem of the survey documents and the less practical but considerably more insistent matter of what he intended to do when he came back to the Baker ranch. The question was not whether he wanted to stay. That had become clear with a speed that should perhaps have alarmed him and instead felt simply true. The question was the more complicated one of what staying actually meant, logistically, practically, in a life he had been building on motion for 7 years. He had a reputation in the horse trade. He had contacts across New Mexico territory, Colorado, and Kansas. He had Colonel Whitfield's contract, which was not his last contract, only his current one. He had a saddle roll and a boarding house room, and 7 years of practiced independence. And none of it, none of the contacts and the contracts and the independence, seemed as worth having as the prospect of another evening at that kitchen table, or another morning at the fence of the paddock watching Theodora Baker work, or another walk in the long grass of the far pasture, with the stars coming up and her steady voice beside him talking about things that mattered. He rode into Santa Fe on the evening of the second day, and went straight to find his contact at the Territorial Records office, a thin, meticulous man named Sandoval who had been working in the same building for 22 years and had a cataloger's memory for documents and their locations. Sandoval required half a bottle of decent whiskey and the better part of an evening to search his mental archives, but by the time the lamp was burning low, he had confirmed that yes, the boundary surveys from the 1863-1865 land rush period had been boxed and moved to the basement archive during the 1871 reorganization. And yes, a survey corresponding to the Baker land parcel number that Raymond had brought with him should be in there. They found it the following morning. It took 3 hours in the dusty basement, sorting through boxes that hadn't been opened in over a decade, but Raymond's hands were the ones that eventually lifted the correct document from between 2 others, a rolled survey map with the Baker parcel number written clearly on the outside, and inside it, a complete boundary survey from October 1863 that matched every point of Theodora's father's deed exactly. Raymond stood in that basement holding the document and felt a complicated thing that was partly the satisfaction of the professional finding what he came for, and partly something much warmer and more personal, the feeling of having something in his hands that he knew would matter enormously to someone who mattered enormously to him. He had certified copies made, filed one with the Territorial Records office under a new clear reference number so it could not be misplaced again, and kept the original and 1 copy for the ride back to Cimarron. He spent 1 more day in Santa Fe, because while he was there was also the matter of certain preparations. He visited 2 offices. He had 2 conversations. He spent a meaningful amount of the profit margin from 3 years of solid horse trading, and he rode north the following morning with the survey documents, a new document of a different kind, and a particular clarity of purpose that made the mountain road feel shorter than it had on the way down. He made it back to the Baker ranch in the late afternoon of the 4th day, coming up the road just as the sun was beginning its descent behind the western ridge. He could see Theodora in the near paddock from the road, which was where she so often was, and the sight of her after 4 days was something that settled in his chest like a weight coming home to rest. She saw him coming and stopped what she was doing, and she watched him ride up with an expression that he had learned to read over 3 weeks of close attention, the particular stillness that was her version of something she didn't want to show too quickly. He dismounted at the fence line, the same fence line where he had first watched her work, and he held up the survey document. She came to the fence, and he handed it over the rail. She unrolled it, looked at the reference numbers, looked at the certification notation from the Territorial Records office, and then she looked at him. "You found it," she said, Martin Baker was a thorough man, Raymond said. He filed everything correctly. It was just buried. She held the document against her chest for a moment and closed her eyes, and he saw the breath go out of her, the particular exhale of someone releasing a weight they have been carrying for longer than they realized. When she opened her eyes, they were bright, not with tears exactly, but with something near to them. "This ends it," she said. "With Judge Caldwell and these documents, yes," he said. "Garrett doesn't have a leg to stand on once this is properly filed." She nodded. Then she looked at him more carefully, in the way she looked at him sometimes, the measuring, wondering way, and she said, "You look like a man who has something else to say." "I do," he said, "but I'd rather say it inside if you're willing." Supper that evening was, in some sense, an ordinary affair. Hector and Weston and Guadalupe all ate together as they always did. The food was good, the conversation was easy. But there was something in the air that Raymond suspected the others could feel, because Guadalupe kept looking at him with an expression that was considerably less suspicious than it had been when he first arrived, and Hector smoked his pipe after the meal with an air of profound satisfaction that seemed to have little to do with the tobacco. After supper, Theodora walked with Raymond out to the front porch in the warm evening air. The stars were out in their improbable abundance. The horses were quiet in the far pasture. The land spread out on all sides, dark and immense and very still. "I went to see a land agent in Santa Fe," Raymond said, "while I was there, not Foster." "A different one." She turned to look at him. "There's a property that borders yours on the northwest side," he said. 60 acres, currently unworked. It has water access and it's in poor shape, but the bones of it are good." "The Higgins property," she said slowly. "Old Henry Higgins left it to his son, who moved to Albuquerque and has been trying to sell it for 2 years. "I bought it yesterday," Raymond said. "The deed was filed this morning." Theodora was very still. The amber eyes were on him in the starlight, and they were doing something complicated. "Raymond," she said. "I'm not explaining myself well," he said. "Let me try again." He turned to face her fully, and he said it straight, because straightness was what she respected, and because straightness was what he meant. "I don't want to leave. I have wanted a reason to stop moving for longer than I've admitted to myself, and I found it here, on this land, with these horses and with you. I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. I'm not asking anything of you at all right now. I bought that land because I want to build something on it, and I want to build it here, near you, near this operation that you've built, because I think this is the finest place I've ever been, and you are the finest person I have ever met." The silence afterward was very long. Somewhere in the distance a coyote called once and went quiet. "That's quite a declaration," Theodora said. "I'm aware of that," he said. "You bought 60 acres of land." "I did. Because of my horses." "Because of your horses," he said, "and because of you. In that order initially, and then very quickly in the other order." She made a sound that was unmistakably a laugh, genuine and sudden, and the sound of it did something extraordinary to Raymond Donovan's heart. He had heard her laugh before, small quiet things over some remark of Weston's at the supper table, but this was a full laugh, unguarded and warm, and it was directed at him, at what he'd said, and it was the most beautiful sound he'd encountered in 31 years. "You are peculiar," she said when the laugh had settled. "I've been told that," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, and the looking had a quality to it that was entirely different from the assessing look she'd given him over the horse prices on the first morning. This was something that had been arrived at through weeks of evidence, through the fence riding and the supper tables and the Santa Fe documents, and the standing at her side when Garrett came through the gate, something that had been slowly and carefully built into something she trusted. "I haven't thanked you properly for all of this," she said. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "I know I don't need to," she said. "I want to." And then she stepped closer to him, and she tilted her face up toward his, and she kissed him. It was not a tentative kiss. It was a Theodora Baker kiss, clear and direct and fully meant, and Raymond's hands came up and found her shoulders, and he kissed her back with everything that had been building in him since the morning he first saw her standing in that corral. impossibly still, impossibly capable, speaking to a wild-eyed roan stallion with her voice and her hand, and some quality he could not name, but had been trying to understand ever since. When they separated, Theodora stood with both hands flat on his chest and looked up at him in the starlight and said, "You should know that I don't do anything halfway." "I had noticed that," he said. "If you are going to be here," she said, with the precise clarity of a woman making a business agreement and a personal one simultaneously, "then you are going to actually be here. This land requires real work and real commitment, and I will not wait around for a man who changes his mind." "Theodora," he said, covering her hands with his own, "I do not change my mind." "Good," she said. And she stayed where she was for a moment longer, and the night was very warm and very quiet around them. And then she said, "Come back inside. I'll make coffee." He followed her inside, and the lamp was burning on the kitchen table, and the house smelled of coffee and wood smoke and that herbal thing he still hadn't identified. And Raymond Donovan felt, with the settled certainty of a man who recognizes something true, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The weeks that followed were full and practical and beautiful in the particular way of new things that are also real things. Garrett received the certified survey documents through his Santa Fe lawyers, and within a week had quietly dropped the procedural challenge to the Baker deed. Judge Caldwell, informed of the document's discovery and filing, noted for the record that the Baker water rights had been properly established and were not subject to further dispute under the existing challenges. Garrett's sorrel did not appear on the Baker Road again, and Raymond had the feeling it would not. The 18 horses were trail-ready on schedule. Raymond arranged for their delivery to Fort Union himself, riding with Hector and Weston on the 3-day drive north, and Colonel Whitfield received them with undisguised satisfaction. He walked the line of animals twice, tested 3 of them personally, and told Raymond they were the finest government horses he'd taken possession of in 10 years. "Where do I get more?" Whitfield asked. "Baker Ranch, Cimarron Valley," Raymond said. "Miss Theodora Baker. Send a letter first and be prepared for her price." He rode back from Fort Union with Hector and Weston through country that was beginning to show the early colors of autumn, the cottonwoods along the Cimarron River going gold, the high ridges darkening with the first cold winds coming down from the north. He rode back knowing he was riding home, which was a thing he had not been able to say in 7 years, and the knowing of it settled around him like a coat that fit. His 60 acres next door was, in the condition he'd bought it, essentially a project. There was a deteriorating house that needed extensive work, a barn that was structurally sound but had been badly neglected, 3 paddocks that needed new fencing, and a stretch of water access that was overgrown but functional. He spent his evenings over the kitchen table at the Baker Ranch with Theodora, planning the work. She was, predictably, excellent at planning. She knew the suppliers in Cimarron and which ones were reliable. She knew which building materials would hold up to the New Mexico winters and which would not. She had opinions about fence post spacing and water trough placement, and the angle of barn doors relative to the prevailing wind that were entirely practical and entirely correct, and she shared them with the same matter-of-fact directness she brought to everything. Raymond worked on the property through October and into November. He brought in 2 men from Cimarron town to help with the heavy work, supplemented by Weston on days when the Baker Ranch's own schedule allowed. And by mid-November the house was sound, the barn was restored, and the fencing was done. It was a modest operation, smaller than Theodora's, but it was solid and it was good. He ran a small herd of his own, 6 horses he'd selected carefully on the drive south from Fort Union, animals he intended to develop alongside Theodora's program, and Theodora walked his paddocks on the first morning he turned them out and studied each animal with the focused attention she brought to every horse she encountered. "The gray," she said, nodding toward a smoke-gray gelding who was investigating the fence line. "Where did you find him?" "Colorado Springs horse dealer. He was selling him cheap because of the temperament. The man didn't know how to read him. Theodora watched the gray for a moment. He's not a bad temperament, he's a thinking horse. He needs a particular kind of handling. She paused. Let me work with him. He's yours, Raymond said. She turned to look at him. To work with, he added, not to keep. Although if you want to keep him, I didn't say I wanted to keep him, she said. You wanted to keep him the moment you looked at him, he said. I was watching your face. The expression that crossed her own face at that was a complicated one, amused and slightly startled, and something softer underneath both, the expression of someone not entirely accustomed to being watched closely by someone who sees accurately. You're annoyingly observant, she said. Comes from years in the horse trade, he said. Reading what's in front of you correctly. She held his gaze. Is that what you're doing, reading me? I've been reading you since the morning you told me my price offer was insufficient, he said. I am not, I should note, complaining about that. The slow, real smile that crossed her face then was the one he'd come to love best, because it took its time arriving and it meant exactly what it looked like. November turned to December, and the days grew short and cold, with frost on the ground in the mornings and wood smoke rising from every chimney in the valley. Raymond and Theodora had settled into a particular domestic gravity, pulling toward each other throughout the day and evening in the way of people who have moved past the uncertainty of weather and are living in the reality of what. He took his evening meals at the Baker ranch more often than not. She rode his property with him on Sunday mornings with the regularity of someone who had incorporated it into her week without making a declaration about it. On Christmas Eve, with the temperature outside dropping toward what Hector predicted would be a hard frost, the Baker Ranch kitchen was warm with the smell of postle and fresh bread, and Guadalupe had brought a bottle of good wine from Cimarron, and they all sat together at the long table, Hector and Weston and Guadalupe and Theodora and Raymond looked around that table and felt something so complete and uncomplicated that it almost surprised him. After the meal, after Hector had said good night and Weston had gone to his bunk and Guadalupe had left for her own small house on the property, Raymond and Theodora sat by the fire in the main room, and it was quiet and warm and the fire made small sounds, and she was sitting beside him on the bench he'd repaired in October because she'd mentioned once that the wood had gone soft and might give way. He said, I have something for you. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small box, plain wood, not decorative. He'd thought about a different kind of box, with a lid on a hinge, but this was Theodora and plain was right. She took the box and opened it. Inside was a ring, a narrow gold band with a single stone set in it, not large, not showy, but clean and well-made, a garnet that was the precise color of her eyes in good firelight. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. Theodora, he said, I would like to stay, not just on the property next door. I would like to stay here with you for all of it. The horses and the hard work and the garret-type problems and the cold mornings and the supper table. I would like to marry you if you're willing and build this life with you properly. The fire made its small sounds. Outside, the frost was settling over the valley. She picked the ring up from the box. She turned it between her fingers. And then she looked at him with those amber eyes and the firelight was in them and she said, I've been running this ranch alone for 5 years and I have been, I will admit this now, considerably more lonely than I was willing to show. And then a man came to buy my horses and I outpriced him and he came back the next morning anyway. She paused. I thought that was interesting. It was, he agreed. And then he was still there the next day, she said. And the day after that. I was, he said. And he went to Santa Fe and found my father's survey documents, she said, and bought the land next door and repaired my bench. She looked at the ring again. Yes, she said, I am willing. He took the ring from her and put it on her finger, and the fit was right. And then she leaned into him and he put his arm around her, and the fire burned down slowly in the grate, and outside the frost made the stars look close and brilliant. And it was Christmas Eve in Cimarron Valley in 1882, and Raymond Donovan had found the only home that had ever completely meant it. They were married in February at the small church in Cimarron, on a Thursday morning when the sky was the clear pale blue of high winter. Judge Caldwell, who had a secondary function as a justice of the peace, was the officiant. Hector stood with Raymond, straight-backed and formal in his best clothes. Guadalupe stood with Theodora, in a dress that was a deep red that suited her. Weston sat in the front pew and cried openly at several points during the ceremony, which no one mentioned to him afterward. The reception was at the Baker Ranch, because it was the natural place for it, and because Theodora said the horses deserved to be nearby for important occasions. Half the valley came, because Theodora Baker was known and respected across 40 miles in every direction, and because people in small communities understand instinctively when something good has happened and want to mark it. Hector made a toast in Spanish that was long and heartfelt and partially incomprehensible to Raymond, but entirely comprehensible in its affection. Raymond toasted his wife, which still seemed to him one of the most remarkable English words he'd ever had occasion to use, with a brevity that he suspected only she understood, was full of everything he could have said at length but chose to say simply. In the spring, Raymond folded his horse trading business formally into an operation that connected both properties, using his contacts and experience to sell the Baker Ranch horses more widely, and at better prices than Theodora had been able to manage alone, not because she lacked the skill but because she lacked the network, and the network was his to give. They negotiated this arrangement at the kitchen table over 2 evenings, and it was a negotiation in the clearest sense, direct and practical and equal, and Raymond found himself smiling through most of it, because negotiating with Theodora Baker was still the most invigorating thing he'd ever done. By midsummer, the Blue Roan Storm had been sold to a wealthy rancher in Colorado for a price that made Colonel Whitfield's contract look modest. Theodora cried briefly over this, in private, and then told Raymond firmly that she intended to breed Storm's characteristics deliberately into the next generation of the herd, and outlined her plan with such specificity that Raymond had no doubt she would accomplish it exactly. Copper, the buckskin gelding, remained where he had always been, not for sale, not ever for sale, running the Baker land with the freedom of an animal who knows he is home. Raymond came to love that horse with the particular affection of someone who had heard about something for so long and found the reality entirely equal to the reputation. The smoke-gray gelding Raymond had brought from Colorado Springs became Theodora's horse in every practical sense, worked daily and understood daily, a thinking horse handled with the particular intelligence he required. She named him Mercury, which Raymond thought was exactly right. Late in the summer of 1883, Theodora told him in the morning, over coffee, in the direct, unadorned way she said everything important, that she was expecting a child. Raymond set down his coffee cup and looked at her and felt something that was beyond the available vocabulary of the situation. He stood up and came around the table and took both her hands and held them and looked at her, and whatever was in his face was apparently satisfactory because she smiled at him, the real smile, the slow one, and said, "We'll need to think about the room arrangement." "I'll build another room," he said. "I'll start today." "You will not start today," she said. "The south paddock fence needs attention today. The room can wait until next week." He kissed her hands and then her forehead and went and looked at the south paddock fence. And later that day, he and Hector had a conversation while working that consisted almost entirely of Hector talking about his late wife's family remedy for morning sickness and Raymond listening, with the intensity of a man collecting information he intends to use. Their son was born in the spring of 1884, on a morning that arrived with considerable drama and was ultimately resolved by Guadalupe, who proved to be calm and competent in this as in all things. He came into the world with a considerable opinion about it, immediately audible, and he was handed to Raymond in the thin April light, and Raymond looked at him for a long time, at this small, impossibly present person, and felt the full weight of what his life had become and was grateful for it with a depth that had no easy edges. They named him Martin, for Theodora's father, Martin Ray Donovan. Hector, presented with the infant the following morning, held him with the careful formality of a man handling something of great value, and said, in Spanish, something lengthy and gentle that Guadalupe translated as being roughly equivalent to, "This child is already beloved." Life on the Baker-Donovan operation, as it had come to be known in the valley and beyond, continued in the way that good things continue, with full days and occasional hard stretches and steady underlying joy. The herd grew and improved. Raymond's sales network extended the reach of the Baker breeding program into Colorado and Kansas, and eventually as far as Texas, where the demand for quality cavalry remounts never subsided. Theodora's program produced animals of consistent excellence, and her reputation preceded her in rooms she had never set foot in, rooms where men argued about bloodlines and breeding and the particular qualities of mountain terrain horses, and her name was in those conversations as an authority. Martin grew from a round-faced infant into a small, observant child who had his mother's eyes and his father's patience, and who demonstrated from a very early age a profound interest in the horses. He was placed on a horse's back for the first time at 2 years old, sitting in front of Theodora with her arms around him, and he sat absolutely still and watched the ears of the animal beneath him with an expression of complete absorption that made Raymond, watching from the fence, laugh with a joy that was entirely uncomplicated. In the spring of 1886, Theodora told Raymond over coffee, in the same matter-of-fact morning way, that they would need to think about the room arrangement again. Their daughter arrived in December of that year, during a snowstorm that came down from the north with serious intent, and she was born at home with Guadalupe presiding as before, and she came into the world with somewhat less drama than her brother but a great deal more presence, if that was possible, looking at the world immediately and calmly as though she was assessing it, and had not yet decided her verdict. They named her Clara, after Martin Baker's mother, who had come west from Virginia in 1855 and had broken ground on the Baker land with her own hands before her son was born. Garrett never returned. Raymond had heard, through the usual channels, that the man had sold his eastern sections and relocated to Colorado, and while Raymond had no particular feeling about this either way, he noticed that Theodora's shoulders sat differently after she heard it, with a looseness that spoke of the final release of something she had been carrying since long before he arrived. One evening in the autumn of 1887, Raymond stood at the fence of the main paddock as the sun went down and watched Theodora work a young colt, a chestnut with 4 white stockings who was 17 months old and being introduced to the lunge line for the first time. Martin, who was 3½ and had recently decided that he was old enough to be present for these things, stood beside Raymond at the fence on a crate he had dragged from the barn, his arms folded on the top rail in a precise imitation of his father's posture. "She's talking to him," Martin said, watching his mother. "She always talks to them," Raymond said. "Does it work?" "It always works," Raymond said. Martin considered this with the gravity of someone processing significant information. "Because she knows what to say. Because she knows how to listen," Raymond said. "You have to listen first before they can hear you." Martin thought about this for a moment more, watching his mother and the chestnut colt with absolute attention. "I want to do that," he said. "I know you do," Raymond said. "And you will." Inside the house, Clara was in Guadalupe's care, and from somewhere in that direction came the smell of the evening meal and the sound of Weston's off-key singing, which had over the years become simply a feature of the landscape, as reliable and unremarkable as the wind. Theodora brought the colt to a walk and looked up at the fence line, and her eyes found Raymond and Martin standing there, and the smile that crossed her face in the fading light was full and unhurried and entirely directed at them. A smile that contained within it 5 years of mornings over coffee and evenings in the pasture and cold winters, and the good smells of the kitchen, and the sound of children in the house and horses in the paddocks, and a life that was not despite its difficulty, but because of everything in it. And Raymond's chest filled with something that had no better name than love, and was more than sufficient as a name. He raised his hand and she raised hers in return, across the distance of the paddock, and it was a small gesture and it meant everything. The evening star came up above the western ridge, where the sky was still holding the last of the day's light, and the horses moved in the pasture, and the house was warm, and the valley was quiet around them in the way of a place that has settled into what it is, which was home. Raymond Donovan had come to Cimarron Valley in the fall of 1882 to buy horses. He had been outpriced so thoroughly, so completely, and with such elegant precision, that in the end he had bought the land next door to stay near them, and then he had stayed near them for the rest of his life, and he had not once, not for a single morning, regretted any part of the price. The Baker Ranch stood for generations after that autumn. The horses bred from Theodora's careful program running on the same land her father had broken ground on in 1863, and the survey documents Raymond had found in the Santa Fe basement hung, framed on the kitchen wall, where they had been placed by Theodora's own hands the week after the wedding, next to a photograph of Martin Baker that showed a man who looked, around the eyes, considerably like his grandson. The ranch became known across the territory, and then beyond it for the quality of its animals, and buyers came from considerable distances, and they were all, without exception, priced accordingly, which was the only way the Baker operation had ever known how to do business, and which Raymond had long since understood was not stubbornness, but the simple recognition of genuine worth. Martin Donovan, at the age of 8, placed his hand flat on the neck of a young gray filly and spoke to her in a low, steady stream, and the filly turned her head toward him and breathed out softly, and Theodora, watching from the fence, put her hand over her mouth and felt something move through her that was not quite tears but was in the neighborhood, the same neighborhood she had been in, years ago, watching her father do the same thing in the same place. Raymond came to stand beside her. "There it is," he said quietly. "There it is," she agreed. Clara at 5 had no patience for standing at fences and watching. She wanted to be in the paddock in the middle of the thing, and she frequently was, small and certain and completely without fear, climbing things and touching things and asking questions in rapid succession that Hector answered with the endless patience of a man who had been answering Baker questions for a very long time and considered it among the more worthwhile things he had done. The valley changed, as valleys do, over the years. New families came. Old families left or stayed. The town of Cimarron grew. The railroad pushed closer, and the territory began the long process of becoming something different from what it had been, though the mountains did not change, and the river did not change, and the particular quality of the light in the late afternoon, the way it turned everything golden and very clear, that did not change either. Raymond's hair went gray at the temples before he was 40, which Theodora noted with what he was fairly certain was private satisfaction, though she maintained a straight face about it. He continued to be observant and patient and thoroughly committed to the things and people he had decided to be committed to, which was his character, and which did not vary. Theodora continued to be direct and capable and occasionally impossible to outnegotiate, which was her character, and which Raymond had loved entirely from the first morning. He encountered it over a kitchen table with coffee between them and the price of 18 horses at issue. Guadalupe stayed. Hector stayed until he was 67, and his knees refused to cooperate with the work, and he retired to a small house in Cimarron that Theodora and Raymond built for him on a plot that was technically part of their land, but was his in every sense that counted. He came to Sunday dinner every week without fail, and he sat at the long table and talked with more frequency than he had ever managed in his working years, as though the words had been accumulating and now had space to come out, and the children adored him. Weston Clark eventually did bring his mother down from Colorado, a small brisk woman named Evelyn who took one look at the Baker Ranch and said it was the finest establishment she'd ever set foot on, which endeared her permanently to everyone. Weston married a girl from the valley 2 years later and settled on a small plot nearby, and remained associated with the Donovan operation for 20 more years. One evening in the late fall of 1888, with the first snow of the season coming down softly outside and the kitchen warm and bright, Raymond and Theodora sat at the table long after the children had gone to bed, with the lamp between them and the snow ticking against the glass, and Theodora said out of a comfortable silence, "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" "Tell me," he said. "The morning you rode up to the fence," she said, "and you sat on your horse and you watched me work. I knew you were there after about 30 seconds. I didn't look up because I didn't want to disturb the horse. You knew I was there that early. I always know when someone is near my animals," she said. "But what I thought when I did look up was that you had waited without fidgeting." She looked at him across the table, the amber eyes warm in the lamplight. "Most men fidget. They talk, or they shift their weight, or they find something to do with their hands. You just waited." "I was watching," he said. "I know," she said. "That was what interested me." He looked at her, at the woman who had priced him out and fed him supper and asked him straight questions and kissed him on a starlit porch and told him she didn't do anything halfway, and who had proceeded to prove that statement true in every dimension for the 6 years since. "I was going to leave the next morning," he said. "When I rode back to Mrs. Alvarez's that first day, I was going to sleep on it and leave." "What stopped you?" "I couldn't stop thinking about you," he said simply. The snow came down outside and the house was warm and the lamp burned steadily between them. "Raymond," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'm glad you couldn't stop thinking about me." "So am I," he said. "Every single day." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and they sat that way for a while, in the comfortable quiet of two people who have built something together that is larger and more real than either of them could have predicted, while outside the snow covered the Baker land in white, and the horses stood warm in their barn, and the children slept, and the valley was still under the winter sky, and everything was as it should be. The years settled into one another with the easy gravity of lived time. The children grew. The horses continued to be exceptional. The land continued to be worked and loved and improved. Raymond and Theodora continued to negotiate with complete equality and occasional spirited disagreement and total mutual respect, which was the foundation of the thing and also the best part of it. Martin, at 12, was already the horseman his mother had been at 12, with his grandfather's instinct reappearing in him as clearly as if it had been bred deliberately. Clara, at 10, had developed a gift for the record-keeping and organizational work that kept the breeding program coherent, and she cataloged bloodlines with a precision that made Guadalupe, still handling that work herself, look at her with something approaching joy. Hector, from his Sunday dinner chair, watched these grandchild-equivalent people grow and said, with the satisfied certainty of a man whose predictions have come true, that Martin Baker's blood was very strong and the land knew it. The Baker Ranch remained the Baker Ranch in name, because it had always been that and the name was part of what it was, and Raymond had never had any inclination to change it. He was a Donovan, and she was a Baker, and the operation they ran together held both names in the deed and in the understanding of everyone who knew the place, which seemed exactly right to both of them. In the spring of 1890, on a morning when the cottonwoods along the Cimarron were fully leafed, and the mountains were clear against the sky, and the horses were moving in the pasture in the particular liquid way of animals who are well in content, Raymond Donovan stood at the fence of the main paddock before the day's work had properly begun, just as he had stood at a different fence 8 years before, and watched his wife Gentle, a young horse with her voice in her hand. He had been buying horses that first morning. He had been outpriced. He had come back. He had found something so much larger and more valuable than 18 horses that the comparison was not quite sensible, like comparing the Cimarron River to the cup of water in your hand, both of them water, both of them real, one of them entirely beyond what you came looking for. The young horse lowered its head toward Theodora's hand. She spoke to it steadily, clearly, with that particular quality that was hers alone. The morning light was on her, and she stood as she always stood, shoulders square, chin level, completely present, completely herself. Martin came around the corner of the barn and climbed up on the fence beside his father, in the posture of a boy who has been watching fences for as long as he can remember and considers it among the more worthwhile uses of time. "She's talking to him," Martin said, for perhaps the 100th time in his life. "She is," Raymond said. "The gray one or the new chestnut?" Clara's voice came from behind them, and she appeared beside her father on his other side, notebook in hand, pencil tucked behind her ear, entirely businesslike at 10 years old. "The new chestnut," Raymond said. Clara opened her notebook and wrote something. "His dam is the sorrel from the Albuquerque line," she said. "I need to note when he first accepts handling." "Note now, then," Raymond said. Clara wrote, with the focused certainty of someone who knows exactly what they are doing. In the paddock, the chestnut stepped forward and put his nose into Theodora's palm, and Theodora turned her head and looked toward the fence, and her eyes found her husband and her children standing there in the morning light, and the smile on her face was the one Raymond had seen for 8 years and had never taken for granted, slow and warm and completely meant. He smiled back, and Clara kept writing in her notebook, and Martin watched the horse with total absorption, and the Cimarron Valley held all of them in its wide, patient, improbable landscape, and the sky overhead was the clear and absolute blue of a place that does not apologize for being beautiful, and everything that needed to be built had been built, and everything that needed to be found had been found, and the day opened ahead of them like a door standing wide.